I was a college student and just finished my exams. I was walking to a cafe to get a cappuccino before catching the bus to go home and take advantage of the free Wi-Fi. There was a man on the street yelling about God and the afterlife. He jumped out in front of me and started asking where I was going when I died. I said to him, "I don't know. I don't care either." Annoyed, I hurried off at a brisk pace. I got to my coffee shop about 2 blocks away, only to notice the man had followed me. He sat down at my table and began telling me about Jesus. I told him I was an atheist to get him to go away. I remember all his arguments being pretty bad for someone who seemed very intent on changing my mind. I left to catch my bus after. I had timed my walk from the cafe to my bus so I didn't have to wait in the cold. I caught it seconds after I arrived at the stop, but I could feel the man still following me. Something was wrong with this guy. 2 weeks later, I was watching the news when I see the man's mugshot. He was preaching outside colleges like mine and was luring women to his church. In actuality, his church was a back alley where he would then furiously rear them. I only escaped because I wasn't the church-going type. Every year for summer holidays, my family and I go to my grandparents' house in a region in France called Bretagne. They had the luck to live on a cliff right next to the beach, which is pretty damn neat. For you to understand the situation I was in, I'll do a quick description of the place, and most importantly, how to access the beach. When we got out of the house, we needed to cross a little road to get to an entrance between bushes. Then it was a clear but narrow path you could take just to enjoy the view of the sea. You could also go down a staircase built into the rock of the cliff. Then you just have to walk on some medium-sized stones, and ta-da, you've arrived at the beach. The place itself was pretty big, but there were only few ways to access it. By the staircase I described, and by another one at the end of it. Also, big thing to mention, as I grew older, I stopped building sandcastles and swimming with my family, and instead started to climb the cliffs by myself for fun. Not the steep ones. It was more so semi-hiking of partially collapsing cliffs. This will be relevant later on. Anyway, on to the story. Last year, after having dinner, I was headed out for a little walk on the beach. No one seemed determined to come with me, so I decided to go it alone. Not a big deal. I did so almost every evening. After going down the staircase, I walked a bit, then sat down on a stone to smoke a joint and listen to some music. Not exactly the smartest place, but hey, I'm a teen in a little village that I go to every summer, and as much as I love my family, it gets pretty boring from time to time. Anyway, I'm enjoying my alone time when I spot a guy out of the corner of my eye, about 40 meters behind me. No big deal, it's a free access beach after all, but I saw that he seemed to be heading his way towards me. His head was shaved, and he had these square-shaped glasses on. He was pretty tan, like he worked outside often. The man was getting closer, but again, it's not like I own this beach. As he was coming next to me, I heard over the music that he was trying to speak to me. I removed my headphones. "Hey, you look familiar. Have we met somewhere before?" I answered with a calm but firm no, but he kept insisting he'd seen me at the beach today. Maybe he did, but there are tons of people on the beach, and I couldn't remember every single person that passed by. The way I was responding clearly implied I was not interested in having a conversation with this man, but he sat down next to me and continued talking, mostly about himself. He said he loved the beach, the weather was nice, it was nice that I was with him. And that's when it started to become something more creepy. He talked about how rare it was to find nice girls, and he was so happy I'm not a bitch. He then asked me my name, where I lived. Of course, I didn't say a thing. He started to lean in closer to me, which made me really uncomfortable. He had this huge grin on his face, and that's when it hit me. Remember when I said there were only a few entrances to this beach? This asshole was sitting right between me and the staircase. I was cornered, no one else was there, and we were completely alone. Even though I'm quite athletic, I'm only 4'9" and 90 pounds. This guy was easily twice my size. He also clearly wanted to continue our discussion, whether I wanted to or not. As I stopped responding, he sounded annoyed, clenching his fists. He asked me if I really was a good girl. Why wouldn't I talk to him then? I was shitting myself at this point. I looked to my left and almost let out a sigh of relief. One of the cliffs I was used to climbing was right next to us. Even if I said they were more like hiking than climbing, I could rush to the top in a matter of seconds, as I'd done it quite often. I didn't think this guy could fare quite as well. I don't want to talk anymore, so goodbye. He looked startled for a moment, looking back at the staircase. That confirmed my suspicions. He thought he'd blocked my only chance of escaping, since the other stairs were too far away. To this day, it still scares me that that was his first reaction. At this point, I'm high, tired, and terrified. I moved to the cliff with a high pace. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see he'd shot upright and was looking in my direction. As soon as I was close enough, I started to jump from rock to rock as fast as I could, even scratching myself in the process. Once I'd climbed up to the top, I looked back down. The man was still looking at me, but not smiling like before. Instead, he was angry, looking like he was on the verge of committing a crime. I sprinted to my grandparents' house, which luckily was pretty damn close. I explained everything to my mother, and the next day I reported the guy to the police station, giving the best description I could. Since it's a small village, they could apprehend him easily if he was a resident. But to be fair, French police sucks, and nothing came of it. My buddies and I were walking home one night from another kid's house. It was Christmas break in the early 90s, in the suburbs of Philly. About a foot of snow was on the ground, and the wind was going pretty crazy too. It was about a 20-minute walk through a neighborhood, and about 5 minutes in, we started hearing what sounded like cats fighting. That was odd, since there was no way any cats would be out in that weather. There wasn't much we could do, so we picked up the pace, but the noise kept getting louder and louder. It was definitely coming from behind the houses as we walked along in the street. Really creeped us out, as it was moving at about our speed, and we couldn't see anything through the weather. The noise was definitely getting louder and more frequent as we went along, almost like a mix between cats fighting and someone screaming. The oddest, creepy noise we ever heard. At one point, we came around a curve, saw my buddy's house, and booked it straight there. We pretty much dove into his front yard, through the garage door, and slammed it shut behind us. We told his parents what happened, and decided to make this an impromptu sleepover. Win-win, Super Mario Kart all night. Fast forward a few weeks later though, and boom, mountain lion attack makes the cover of the Daily Times. Not in our neighborhood, mind you, but somewhere nearby. I fired up my brand new Galaxy 2000 and Googled it on an encyclopedia. It had a video clip of a mountain lion, and I got chills when it started belting out those exact same creepy sounds we'd heard all night. And that's the time we got stalked by a mountain lion. Some background information before we get into it. This was February of 1956. My grandma was 18 at the time and in her freshman year at a large, well-known state university in the Northeast Division of the Midwest. She describes this time in college as the most freedom she'd ever had, even with the very strict curfew for girls in particular, and an upsetting amount of racism and sexism that fueled school culture, both from faculty and from students. The school had a very secretive approach to matters of crime on campus. Anyway, on to the story. This is from her perspective, mind you. I was in the first few months of the winter semester, and I had come down with the Hong Kong flu that had been going around campus. I remember hating every second of it, especially because I had to get my first ever shot of penicillin. We had a lot more space on campus than there is now, so in order to prevent my roommate from getting sick, they had me boarding in the convalescent room that was on the first floor of my actual dorm. It was in a new wing that was still having the finishing touches added onto it. I unpacked my belongings for my stay until I was no longer contagious and decided to do some homework since my stomachache was keeping me up. From my room, I could see maintenance workers doing their jobs and getting the additional rooms ready due to the fact that the flu was running rampant on campus. There was going to be a greater need for convalescent rooms for students to recover in without getting others sick as well. I had been sitting at my desk doing homework with hair in curlers and in my jammy shirt and underwear. After a few hours of doing this, I realized it was about 10 now, so I decided to get some rest and continue on tomorrow. I'm not sure how long I was asleep for, but out of nowhere, my locked door was opened and the lights were turned on. I immediately woke up, thinking there must be some sort of fire or campus emergency. I held the cover up to my chin and sat up, only to see a man who seemed to be in his late 40s closing the door behind him as he walked into my room. As I heard the door shut and lock, I realized an emergency alert was the last thing on this man's agenda for the night. I thought it was so odd that he had turned the lights on because it allowed me to notice every single detail about this man. He walked towards me, putting his finger over his lips, which led me to notice how awful his complexion was and how bright red his hair was. He was wearing a suede rust-colored bomber jacket and these green corduroy pants. As he was walking toward me, the only thought I could form in my brain was I could not let this man see how I was dressed. He seemed to walk towards me in slow motion. As he got nearer, I realized he was carrying an unusually sharp screwdriver with him. For some reason, in my panic, all I could think about was still him seeing me in my jammy shirt and underwear. "What are you doing here? I'm very sick. You're gonna get sick too." "Just be quiet and you won't get hurt." At this point, he was right beside me in my twin-sized bed, holding the screwdriver to my throat. I held the covers as close to my face as possible. I kept on going on about this flu going around, saying he was going to get real sick too. All of a sudden, he just snapped at me, pushing harder into my neck with his screwdriver. He interrupted my speech on contagious airborne illnesses with a very harsh, "Shut up, you stupid little girl. Be quiet and let me see your body." I don't know why, but for some reason, I decided to stay the course of my original strategy. I started talking his ear off about all the different ways he could be getting sick right now, and that would be such a shame. He looked at me with this puzzled look on his face, as if he couldn't understand why I wasn't letting him get a single word in of his shut-up interjections, regardless of how many times he threatened me. I noticed his grip on me began to slowly loosen, and eventually he made his way walking back before dashing out of my room. I know for a fact I heard him exit through the fire door next to me, but I found it odd the alarm hadn't gone off. At that moment, the seriousness of the situation flooded into me, and I burst into tears, running and screaming toward the RA who had been napping in their office. From there, the campus police were called, but because of their blatant disregard for my account of the events, they told me I was being hysterical and it was only a bad dream. As soon as I told them he had escaped through the fire door but the alarm hadn't gone off, my story was chalked up to me being over-emotional. I didn't hear anything else regarding this, and I hadn't told my parents out of fear they wouldn't let me finish my degree. About a week later, I had campus police come to me, asking me to come with them. I had no idea why they needed me, and hardly spoke to me the entire time. All they told me to do was walk up to a bench full of men and identify the one I had dreamt about, then leave. It wasn't until nearly a year later I found out what this really was. Apparently, a week after my incident, a young woman had been found dead, assaulted and covered in stab wounds, specifically around her neck. Me identifying my dream assailant was the confirmation they needed to link him to her murder. The man had been hired as an electrician for the school's new buildings, so he had access to the keys of the newly renovated room I'd been in. That explained how he'd got into my locked room. That also explained how he was able to exit the fire door with no alarm sounding. I'm guessing he did what electricians do and found a way to disarm it. I was left in the dark about all of this and only found out from begging my RA to explain at least some details regarding this case. All I know now is the man was found guilty and sent to the state hospital for the criminally insane. I know nothing else. Looking back, I guess I was lucky in that moment. My only concern was that I didn't want this man to see me in my undergarments. Had I recognized the real danger I was in, who knows how I would have reacted or how he would have responded. I just came back from dinner with my mom, and we talked about something that happened literally 20 years ago. While we did, I thought it would be a good story to share. Before I can jump in, I need to sketch out the surroundings a bit. At the time, my mom was 43, and I was 18. Our relationship wasn't very good either. Admittedly, that was pretty much my fault. I was a rebellious teenager back then, and importantly for the story, I was caught up in the metal scene, among other things being the vocalist of a black metal band. Next to that, I had picked up a liking for weed. My mom stood out far less in both attire and personality. Although, and yes, this is important too, she likes the color blue and had long blonde hair. Behind our house stood a house owned by Social Services, an organization that provided sheltered living. In there lived 3 men, Abe, Bart, and Carl. Abe and Bart were obviously in need of help, but completely harmless. Carl was, even in that company, a bit special. Not on first sight, mind you. He was a rather diminutive guy who dressed quite well. Still though, if people are really detached from reality, you just have to look into their eyes and you'll know right away. Carl might have been heavily medicated, but he was still batshit crazy. I don't know what his problem exactly was. I'm not a psychiatrist or anything, but in a nutshell, he suffered severe religious delusions and was convinced that some people were angels, demons, or characters from the Bible. I didn't know that, but in hindsight, let me give you a rundown of how I looked when I returned home from a show. Long hair, a beard, rather muscular build, a black frock like monks wear, studded leather belt, and arm bracelets. There was also a big pentagram around my neck. In short, after seeing me walk around like that a few times and hearing the frequent arguments with my mom and I, Carl became convinced I was a literal demon. Here comes the catch though. My mom was the Virgin Mary, whom I apparently wanted to abduct into hell. He had his medication though, so he wasn't a danger to anybody. Until a hot summer day, when I got a visit from the police because I'd gotten into a fight. So what did my mom do? She invited the cops to sit in the yard while they talked to me. To Carl though, that was somehow the straw that broke the camel's back. The cops left and my mom and I started arguing. At that same moment, Carl started skipping his medication. A week later, I had a show in a neighboring city, so around 3 a.m. I returned. Because I wasn't that stupid, I didn't drink or smoke before getting in my car, but I was planning on doing that afterwards. In the car were 2 of my bandmates, Andres and Quentin. I go inside, my mom is fast asleep. I grab a few beers while they sit in the garden. We sit, chat, smoke, drink. All is great, until Carl decides to act. "What the fuck?" said Andres. He pointed at the hedge at the end of our garden. All three of us, intoxicated by then, watched Carl dressed in a white gown with an aluminum circle on his head wrestle himself through the hedge. "What do you think you're doing?" I said. "Begone, forces of evil," he shouted, waving at us a rather large cross as long as my arm. In that moment, I admit we didn't know what to do. If you think about it, he probably took that as a sign the cross worked. He ran right past us to my open back door, my cue to run behind him, screaming at him to stop. He entered my house, screaming he was coming to save the Virgin Mary. My mom woke up from all the shouting. She was wearing white PJs and had her hair loose. Carl must have thought she descended right down from heaven, because he bolted up the stairs, fell to his knees, and started praying. The three demons behind him were strangely enough not repelled. I grabbed him by his scrawny neck. I mean, we had our problems, sure, but this was my mom we're talking about. He jumped up though, wrestled himself free, and managed to smack Quentin across the head with his cross. Andres and I backed up, looking at each other and nodding. Carl was going to go down. My mom yelled out to stop as loud as she could though. She walked up to Carl and took his hand. "I think you're seeing this wrong," she said. He looked up to her and started crying. I mean ugly bawling. He told her he just wanted to protect her from us. I know, but that isn't really necessary. Look, he's just a kid that likes to dress himself up. I don't really like it either, but it's just a game." She motioned at me and I let loose the frock and the belt and all that stuff. Underneath, I was only wearing my boxers. Carl was still on his knees crying. Quentin was sitting against the wall holding his head, and I'm standing there in my boxers. Carl took a deep breath. "But you're the Virgin Mary." "I'm just a nice lady," she said, "and these are my son and his friends. You're Carl. It's all okay." He looked at me, then at my mom, stood up and grabbed his cross. He looked at it and said in an almost childish voice, "Didn't I tell you?" After that, he made his way downstairs, through the garden, through the hedge, and back to his own place. Later, the cops showed up. We explained everything, and the next day, Carl moved out. That was the story about the one man I don't want to meet again, and how I learned that my mom is underneath her appearance, brave and smart as fuck. 2 days later, his social worker paid us a visit, telling us what happened in Carl's mind leading up to that night, repeating over and over how happy we were that we were unharmed. I, by then my usual teenage bragging self, said I would have dealt with him. The social worker shook his head. Apparently Carl told him he didn't only have that cross, he also had a large knife hidden under his gown.